Hey everyone, it's the Kung Fu Genius, aka Alex Richter. If you're listening to us on audio only, I'd appreciate you reviewing and rating the podcast wherever you listen to it. And if you're watching us on YouTube, of course, if you like what I do here, don't forget to subscribe to the Kung Fu Genius and hit that bell for notifications. I have an announcement for Kung Fu Genius fans. Right now, for a limited time, you can get a 1-month all-access trial subscription to Wing Chun Illustrated magazine absolutely free. No strings attached after that free month either. Go to WCInewsstand.com to register in the upper right corner. Fill in your email and password and use the code KFG trial to get 1 month free access to all the issues published from 2011 to the current issue. How cool is that? All the issues. And if you want that information again, it's in the description below. And with that, let's get started.
All right, peeps. On today's episode of the Kung Fu Genius, the Genius will be chatting with John Little, considered by many to be one of the foremost experts on Bruce Lee. Lots of gems, lots of insight, lots of Bruce Lee. Let's get to it.
He is unstoppable, unbeatable, unbelievable. He's Alex Richter, the Kung Fu Genius.
And every day, I practice martial arts.
Watch out!
Word is, I'm a Kung Fu genius. Practiced all day like a genius.
Hey John, thank you so much for doing this today. I really appreciate it.
Hey, my pleasure, Alex. I like your show, and it's fun to talk to you.
Thank you. Now, before we get started, obviously, a lot of our listeners probably know who you are. They've read all your books, but maybe they don't know too much about how you got started, how you got into this. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about your early background, what kind of brought you to eventually working with the Lee estate, what your interests were, and how you got into that.
Well, I was a child of the 70s. So when the movies came out, like most people my age, we were blown away by it. We didn't know anything about martial arts per se. It was, we knew boxing, we watched boxing. But then, I hate to say it, but actually the Kung Fu TV series and David Carradine, who is an asshole in your book, was a huge, it was like he opened our eyes to what is this? It looked like effortless fighting, which of course, to a lazy man such as myself, offered great appeal. So I was very intrigued by the Kung Fu TV series and what I saw. I later learned, of course, that was Tai Chi for the most part, not necessarily a combative art, but it was enough to intrigue me because I was too naive at the time to recognize that this was fully choreographed. I wasn't watching a real window into the past and Kwai Chang Caine taking on all of these big burly guilos single-handedly. So that piqued my interest. And in the summer of '73, my parents had a cottage about an hour and a half north of Toronto. And they used to drag us up there screaming and kicking because all our friends were back in the city. So one day my dad took me into town. It was a small town, population 500. And I went into a variety store looking for something to read, a comic book, something. And I happened to see on the stands an issue of a new publication then called Fighting Stars. And on the cover was Bruce Lee and Bob Wall, and it teased this forthcoming movie, Enter the Dragon. But more importantly, it had a profile on Key Luke, Master Po from the Kung Fu TV series. So I had to buy it. So I bought the magazine, took it back to the cottage, read it cover to cover, reread it cover to cover. And after reading it, the first page of the magazine had a memorial to Bruce Lee, this fellow who had died. And I knew very little about Bruce Lee. I remembered him vaguely as Kato in the Green Hornet. But back then it was like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. You either liked Batman or you liked the Green Hornet. You couldn't like them both.
Right.
So I was a Batman guy. So wasn't interested in the Green Hornet. Didn't care about whatever it was Kato did or the Black Beauty. The Batmobile, Adam West were where it's at. So it was just, to me, it was an eyebrow raiser. Oh, this guy was Kato. That's cool. And they mentioned Longstreet, which I'd never seen. But the movie sounded very intriguing, and it was Kung Fu, just like the name of the TV series. So I thought I had to go see this. And eventually, about a month later, the film came to Toronto, and I talked my parents into driving me to the theater so I could see it. And it was like a baptism by fire. Suddenly, I didn't know about David Carradine. I'd just been exposed to something that was mind-blowing. And again, we were naive back then in the 70s, because when Kung Fu came out and the movies came out, we honestly believed that if you could learn these techniques, you could be like those guys on the screen, and who are we? And we had no frame of reference, right? You had Bruce Tegner's books were the only martial arts books you could get. Maso Yama's book on karate was out, so that was a must-have. And then we looked for anywhere we could learn this mystical, magical art, and the movies kept coming, and they were worse. The Bruce Lee ones were great, so we'd go and watch that. And then when Bruce Lee died and no more movies were coming, we were willing to accept the Bruce Lies and the Bruce Lays and everything else, because it kept our nascent enthusiasm going for this image that we had. But anyway, this endured, and I had every Bruce Lee poster you could get. I used to drive or take the bus down to Chinatown every weekend and get the Hong Kong publications. Any new posters that came up, my room was a shrine to Bruce Lee. And if you were a friend of mine back in 1975 and 76, and you didn't want to talk about Bruce Lee, we had nothing to talk about, because that was it. So anyway, this continued on, and I remember I used to sneak into the movie theaters with an 8mm movie camera and film them.
Wow.
And then go back and watch Bruce's techniques, his body mechanics. And I honestly believed I was really getting there. I was pretty close.
Right.
And then one night I foolishly challenged 8 guys to a fight and found out there's a big difference between film fights and reality.
Wow.
And then, just your interests change. I got interested in exercise and fitness. So I retained that element from Bruce. And eventually landed a job with Joe Weider's Muscle and Fitness magazine.
Uh-huh.
And at the time I thought, what would be really cool is an article not on Bruce Lee's martial art techniques, because that's been already at that point had been done to death. But how did he build the physique that he built? Because it wasn't just martial arts.
Sure.
I remember going to a karate school and asking, geez, how did Bruce Lee get to be like that? Well, he took karate. Oh, really? Yeah. So, I enrolled for karate. Never mind that the instructor looked nothing like Bruce Lee physically. And there's lots of martial artists that are very diligent in the practice, but they don't have a physique like Bruce Lee did. So he had to be doing something. So that was the genesis for my suggesting doing an article. This is 1994 on Bruce Lee's training methods. That gave me entree to interview his students and his widow, and ask very specific questions about his supplemental training. And as is typically the case in print, when you write an article, not all of it will get in if an ad comes in at the 11th hour that needs that space. So part of the article got cut, which floored me, because I thought, if there's one person like me out there, there's 1,000 that want to know everything that he did in terms of training. And here is this information that's going to get put on the cutting room floor. So I called Linda and apologized and just said, I'm really sorry. I said, I did so much research on this. I said, enough research to fill a book, and got it down to what I thought was a pretty compact but thorough piece. And they've cut part of it out. And she said, well, if you have enough information to do a book, why don't you do it? And that took me aback. I thought, what exactly are you saying? And she said, yeah, why don't you come out to Boise and I'll let you go through Bruce's stuff and you can see if there's any other material. Yeah, I was a kid in a candy shop, right? So I couldn't get on the plane quick enough. But she met me at the airport and handed me 2 volumes of his commentaries on the martial way, his actual writings, and said, here's a good place to start.
Wow.
So it was like holy writ. I went to the hotel and I was like gingerly turning pages and looking at them. And anyway, long story short, if that's possible at this point, I ended up making photocopies of anything I could get my hands on in the archive. She took me into a storage locker, opened the door, and woof, there it's all Bruce's stuff, right? So it was like Aladdin's cave. And I returned to California with 40 pounds of photocopied material.
Wow.
I then flew back and came back with 30 pounds of photocopied material. I spent the next year transcribing all of it. And it ended up filling, if you'll excuse me for a minute, I might be able to pull one out. It ended up filling 3 volumes like this.
Wow.
Which was all his writings that I transcribed. And I organized them according to physical training, martial arts, and techniques, and then philosophy. And each volume, there's 3 of them this size. And I said to Linda, I said, you know, it's difficult for me to tweeze this out and hold it up as this is the most important thing about Bruce. So then it was discussed that we should try and do a book series based on the surviving writings. And one of the things I noticed when I was writing and transcribing and photocopying was that a lot of material was left out of the what's called the Tao of Jeet Kune Do.
Right. The first attempt to kind of put his notes out there.
Yeah. And even the name to me was odd. The Tao of Jeet Kune Do means the way of the intercepting fist.
And it mixes both Mandarin and Cantonese, which messes my OCD to no
and
no
Japanese. Karate Do,
Right,
Kendo. So when I first got the Tao of Jeet Kune Do in 1975, again, this was the magic book. But I remember reading and just being confused. Like I couldn't find an anchor point anywhere in the text. It was going from, even the tiger can't find space to insert its fierce claws to the liberation of the individual, and was like, what am I reading?
Right.
And when I was transcribing, I was able to compartmentalize it better. It was like, oh, this was written, 59 to 64. So this would have been more of his, heavy Wing Chun period. And after the injury, came this liberate yourself, and there was a heavy emphasis on Western boxing and fencing. And if you saw it that way, you could see the evolution, you could trace it of Jeet Kune Do. And one of the things where the philosophical point came into the art that was interesting was that Bruce, when he first came to the US, he wanted to create a super Chinese martial arts system. So he would seek out any guys off the boat that were Choi Li Fut or Hung Gar or whatever, right, and see what their magic techniques were. He already had his Wing Chun, right? So that was the idea. He wanted to create a Chinese super system. And if you listen to his interviews from that time, he's always talking about how Kung Fu is the grandfather of every other martial art in the world. Right. All went back to China. All roads led to China. And then when he created his own art, he was very big on the principles of fencing, stop, hit, for example, and its interception. So the premise of his art, and hence the name of it, was the art of interception, essentially. So if you go to move to me and I intercept you, then I don't have to do a simultaneous block strike, right? It's just one strike. But then after his back injury and reading Krishnamurti and things like that, he began to recognize that he had just created a cage, which is, if you're not doing interception, like the whole art was interception. If you didn't have anything to intercept, you had nothing. So remove the cage and just do whatever you need to do, given what the situation allows for or presents itself. So it went through that stage from Chinese super system to the art of interception, to eradicating any and all restraints that could inhibit you expressing whatever you need to express in a fight.
Interesting. That's amazing. I mean, I think for any hardcore Bruce Lee fan to even have a chance to look at his notes, I mean, that is quite literally the holy grail for Bruce Lee fans. Now, one of the things that's talked about a lot on YouTube and on videos is, especially now in the wake of MMA, which was, did Bruce Lee really fight, and so on and so forth. And for me, the funniest is like, well, he never fought in MMA. And I'm like, in 1968? When? Like, it's kind of ridiculous. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the real fights that Bruce Lee had, the things that we do know about. I mean, obviously, there are probably lots of little scuffles and fights he may have had here and there, which no one really knew much about. But it kind of starts in terms of like what we have a record for with this Gary Elms boxing match that he had in 1958 when he had just been doing Wing Chun for a little bit, and he beats Gary Elms, who's like the local boxing champ at the high school level for King George V. And so I've read about it. There's a great Bloody Elbow article about it. You've had the chance to look at Bruce Lee's notes and stuff. Is there any insight you have or anything that you know about this fight, or maybe perhaps how it affected Bruce Lee?
Well, I knew very little about it, even when I was working with the estate, because the diary that he had from '58 was sold at the auction, and the auction I think was '93, Superior Galleries, but there was an excerpt in the catalog, defeated champion Gary Elms,
right,
and so that was basically all we knew about it. There were photographs which have since been suspect or considered suspect of Bruce boxing in that tournament. But I had my eyes open to that fight only recently when we did a film, David Peterson, whom you've had on your show.
Yes.
We did a film on Wong Leong. And so as part of the film, we interviewed all of his students that we could, one of whom was Rolf Klausnitzer. And this one blew me away because Rolf was there.
Wow.
He saw the fight. And in his account of it, he was saying that he had met Bruce Lee, didn't know who he was. Of course, Bruce Lee was unknown at that point, at his house. His brother brought him home one night. This was like a month before the fight. And Bruce was demonstrating his Wing Chun at the school, St. Francis Xavier, and invited Rolf to try and do something to it. And of course, Bruce trapped and used his Wing Chun on it, which blew him away. Rolf was like, how do I learn this? And anyway, Rolf's brother went to King George, the 5th school. So they knew about the boxing tournament. They were going to cheer on their boy, Gary Elms, and they knew Bruce. So anyway, he watched the fight and said the same thing. He said Bruce stood in essentially a bai jump and was deflecting any and all punches that came to him from Gary Elms using Wing Chun. And at the time, it was believed that upward turn at the wrist at the end of the punch generated additional torque. And so Bruce was doing that with his punches. But because of the gloves, it was like it didn't have a dramatic impact other than it was strong enough to knock this guy Gary Elms on his back. And this happened 4 or 5 times during the fight. And Bruce won, unanimous decision. Elms, according to Rolf, didn't lay a glove on Bruce the entire fight.
Wow.
Couldn't touch him. But after the fight, Bruce was really pissed off. When he and Rolf and his brother went up to ask him, he said, I couldn't knock the bastard out. He said that never worked. But that was his first fight. And it was Wong Leong claimed that he had coached Bruce for that fight, which is entirely possible. No reason to disbelieve him. But he said that Bruce used Wing Chun, and initially the crowd kind of snickered when he got into his Baijong stance, as opposed to the boxing stance that Gary Elms had. He said, but they stopped snickering once he started hammering this guy. And the fact that Elms couldn't touch him. So that was his earliest recorded fight. And it was, unlike the latter day Bruce Lee, it occurred within a sporting context, which he later eschewed.
Right.
So it was a big fight, an important fight. And the rooftop fight you mentioned also, I think, helped instill in him that killer instinct that you need for the streets.
Absolutely. I recently got a hold of Bruce Lee, The Man Only I Knew, that Linda had published back in 1975. I managed to get a mint copy of it from someone who clearly didn't know how much that book was worth now. So in there, it has apparently 2 excerpts from that diary or that day timer that you said was sold at the auction. And one was the date of the Gary Elms fight. And the other one was shortly after. I think the Gary Elms fight was in March. And then in May, he had a fight with a Choi Lei Fut guy, a student of Long Tai Chuen. And he got a black eye, but he knocked the other guy out. And apparently he knocked his tooth out. Now, it seems the rumor is that was the fight that Bruce kind of got in trouble for, that was essentially the straw that broke the camel's back for him having to go to the States. And there's a lot of back and forth as to whether did he really have to leave because he was like in trouble? Was it just a general decision that they wanted him to do something, take a new direction with his life? Like, because some people kind of point to, I guess the father of this guy might have been a detective, and then Bruce got in some trouble. The problem is it's always quite unclear when you hear these stories. Did you hear anything about this fight with the Choi Lei Fut guy? Which is actually funny because because Bruce wrote that he knocked out the guy, or knocked out the tooth of this guy, and he was a student of Long Tai Chuen. And I actually know Long Tai Chuen's son, Long Kai Ming, who still is in Hong Kong. He's quite old. So when I read this, I was like, oh, I couldn't believe it. And I'm going to have to go back and see if I can find out more. Do you know, was there in fact like an event like this, like he had a fight and maybe that guy's father was kind of a big deal and he had to leave? Because that's a story that's sometimes told. Did you ever get any confirmation on that?
I've never had confirmation on it, and I've heard nothing but contradictory reports, just like you. One was that it was the son of a police detective. Two, it was the son of a triad chief. And the problem is that if Bruce had, or his parents and his family had friends in the police department in Hong Kong, so I don't think it would have been a big deal. William Chung's father was in the police department.
Right, he was a detective, yeah.
So I think that could have been quashed. I think the simplest answer probably is that he wanted to retain his U.S. citizenship, and he was 18 years old.
He had to come back to claim it. He was going to lose it, I guess, if he stayed too long.
Yeah, come back to do it, and I'm sure that his parents thought that there was a little too much fighting going on, which probably could lead to something bad happening, jail sentence, something that would negatively impact his life. And consequently, maybe it'd be a good time for him to get away from all of this, go to school in the United States. They had friends there that could house him, and keep an eye on him.
Right.
And I think that was what he did. An interesting side note, there was, of course, Linda had written in her book that when Bruce left Hong Kong, his father gave him $100.
Right. That's the famous story.
Yep. And away he went. I thought, well, okay, that's cool. I mean, it was always in my mind because I'd read it, and like most fans, you memorize this kind of trivia. But I remember I was, we had rented an office in Idaho, and that's where we moved in all Bruce's stuff. And I bought a couple of bookcases from IKEA or something, and assembled them and put all his books from his library up on the shelves. And there was a couple of steamer trunks that had some of his stuff in it, and his tiger skin and this other stuff. But
wow, you saw the famous tiger skin?
I did.
Wow, that thing is like iconic. The photos that he had in front of him.
Yeah, it actually appeared in Game of Death, I believe.
That's right. It was on the throne where Dan Inosanto sat, right? I think. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. But but anyway, in the steamer trunk was some clothing. There was an old, like a brown corduroy suit jacket and whatever. And I said to Linda, I was getting something to hang these up on. I said, "Oh, this is kind of cool." An old suit jacket. And I went into the pocket and there was $100 bill. And I said to her, no way, this is the legendary $100 bill, but it was there and clearly Bruce had put it there. And she said, could be. Yeah,
wow.
Could be.
Wow. You should check the note, see when it was printed.
I know, I should have. But I was just stunned that there was anything in the pocket at all, let alone a $100 bill.
Yeah, wow. And knowing Bruce, he would have been like, hey, how come you didn't take that $100 bill? Don't waste it.
And I think the antiquity of the jacket would have put it around 1960 or 59. So
wow.
Who knows? But it was kind of an intriguing find.
Interesting. Also funny how you say, back to that fight that he had, either the guy, his father was a police detective or a triad, and that's always the problem when you hear these stories, especially stuff on the Hong Kong side. It's just the amount of contradictions. Of course, I think it's kind of funny though, because before 1974, there was no what do they call it? Internal affairs in the Hong Kong police, and corruption was rampant. So part of the reason why they may not be sure is because that guy's father may have both been a detective and a member of the triads. So it's possible that those two things could have simultaneously been true, right?
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
so later, and my introduction to actually learning Wing Chun started in the Seattle area. So I had actually started with people who had originally learned from James DeMille and Ed Hart in that Seattle pre-Jeet Kune Do period. That's how I got into it. So a lot of the Seattle lore is also very interesting for me. And Bruce Lee had another fight there with another karate practitioner around 1961 in the handball court of the YMCA in downtown Seattle.
Right.
Supposedly the fighter was Yoichi Nakachi, but I've heard back and forth. They're pretty sure it was him, but it could have been someone else. And this fight was pretty spectacular because apparently Bruce just ripped through this guy with chain punches and a kick to the face. Did you read or find out anything about that fight in Seattle?
I interviewed Jesse, of course, he was there. Ed Hart was there. He was, I think Ed was a timekeeper.
Yes.
So it was kind of interesting because after I interviewed them, I transcribed the interviews and then sort of put them side by side, right, to check and make sure there was consistencies. And it seems very consistent. And I mean, to me, that is one of the most interesting fights of Bruce Lee's life, if not the most interesting fight. He was fighting a martial artist from a completely different discipline than the Chinese artists. And this guy was good.
Right.
By all accounts, Jesse told me this guy was a very tough street fighter. He was in knife fights. He was also like a black belt in judo. So he had grappling skills. And I forget what style of karate, but it was, obviously he was like a first or second degree black belt in karate. This was not a slouch.
Right. And he was Japanese. I mean, it's like as legit as it comes.
Oh yeah. This was part of the culture, right? And Bruce was. I mean, it's a very cool image that emerges of Bruce, of this guy leaving the racquetball court to change into his gi, and Bruce just kicking off his street shoes and having on an undershirt ready to go.
Right.
And then as soon as it starts, he chain punches this guy across the length of the court, slams him up against a wall. There was some sort of strike which both Ed Hart and Jesse told me about, which is like a double strike, which I'm unfamiliar with. Right. And I don't see it in Wing Chun typically, so I have no idea what technique that was. But it was a double strike Bruce hit this guy with that dropped him. And then he kicked the guy in the head, and according to Jesse, the guy backflipped and was out cold. He thought he was dead. Or as Jesse in his words said, he looked like he was leaving this world.
Wow.
And then, of course, Ed's anecdote, too, was that they went over to Ed was the timekeeper. And he looked at his stopwatch, and it had lasted 11 seconds. And when this guy started to come to, he said, how long did I last? That was his first question. And Ed said he felt so sorry for him, he just doubled the time, 22 seconds, like as if that was some sort of consolation.
Right. You didn't even make half a minute.
But you know what's really cool about that is you watch a Bruce Lee movie where he fights a black belt, whether it's Bob Baker, allegedly a black belt in the Chinese Connection, or it's Bob Wall in either Enter the Dragon or Way of the Dragon, and the fights are always sort of drawn out and dramatic, and with the Bob Baker fight, it's about just under 10 minutes long, and the other ones are about a minute and a half, 2 minutes. In real life, he took a black belt out in 11 seconds.
Right.
That's amazing. Like, people used to say, well, whatever you saw Bruce Lee on the screen, in real life, he was even better. And you go, yeah, right. How could that possibly be? Well, he was, again, 11 seconds versus 10 minutes. That's the difference. And as he himself used to say, if I were to be completely reality oriented in my fight sequences in film, you'd call me a bloody, violent human being, and it would be over. There'd be none of this artistry stuff.
Right.
And that's true. I remember Ted Wong, when I was training with him, and of course, I was all sorts of questions, what was Bruce like to spar with, and he'd say, well, not like you see in the films. He said there's none of this bouncing around stuff. He was deadly still, and then boom, he'd move. So it was like this juxtaposition of the cinematic image versus the reality. And I think that's lost on people that haven't been around real fights. You know, in the cinema, I mean, anybody, Cynthia Rothrock can beat 20 people.
Right.
You know, and Chuck Norris can, and Bruce Lee can. And it's just assumed everybody moves like that. And once you kick a guy, he stays down. He doesn't get up again and take another swing at you. But in real life, it's much faster. It's more brutal, and it's over way quicker, typically. And, you know, Bruce Lee knew that. But he also had this artistry within his soul that he knew how to project this image of the heroic. Excuse me, I don't know what's wrong with my throat, but coffee may help.
Tim Hortons, that's how we know you're from Canada.
I know, you couldn't be more Canadian than that. So anyway, I just found that very interesting. That fight in Seattle to me was very telling. And it was as, you know, as real as a heart attack. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. I always thought, and probably the most, I mean, in terms of a description of how the fight went from beginning to end, that's probably the clearest of all of them.
Yeah.
And yeah, I thought that you very, very classic Wing Chun, very straightforward. I think a lot of people, especially like the millennials who only see some of the film stuff and they don't realize how serious he was about martial arts for fighting, and then the movie thing being something else, and him being one of the rare individuals who could pull off both. Whereas nowadays you have people who are just phenomenally skilled with flips and tricks and all this kind of stuff, but they don't necessarily have the real fighting experience and understanding that Bruce Lee had. And I think that gets lost a little bit in the new generation. They don't realize how dead serious he was about martial arts.
Oh, yeah. And you know, it's interesting, too, because a lot of talk presently is about, you know, MMA and grappling, and that's all good, but this wasn't lost on him. I mean, jiu-jitsu is not new. The books that were available in the 60s were jiu-jitsu and judo and karate, if you knew where to find them. And he poured through all of those. He knew Wally J, who was a jiu-jitsu guy, and Wally J will tell you, well, he would tell you if he was alive, that you couldn't do anything with Bruce. He was just too fast. And it's not to say, you know, he was invincible. I mean, we all know very well that fighters lose fights occasionally, even phenomenal fighters. But there was nobody that belled the cat during his lifetime, you know, and that included a wide swath of various disciplines. You know, I'll tell you an interesting thing that Ted Wong told me. You can interpret it and tell me what you think of it. But it was in one of my first lessons with Ted, and of course I was pretty green. I hadn't yet made the distinction of the evolutionary process of Jeet Kune Do. And so it was all a hybrid to me. You know, it was Wing Chun, it was boxing, it was almost an eclectic view, because that was what we were led to believe it was via the magazines in the 80s, in the 90s. But he had told me at one point that Bruce told him that Ip Man was training someone to come and kill him, which blew my mind. And it was like, I said, are you sure? Because I didn't even know who Ip Man was, you know, at that point, other than he taught Bruce Lee when he was like 15 in Hong Kong. But yeah, he said, yeah, Bruce was convinced that Ip Man was training someone to come over and kill him. So he wanted to be able to deal with any element of Wing Chun that was coming at him.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
That blew my mind, but I don't know the specifics of it. I don't know the context of it. I just know what Ted told me, and Ted didn't lie to me. So I presume Bruce told him that.
Right. That's incredible. I mean, I'll have to look into it a little bit. That's the first time I've ever heard anything like that before. Obviously, people know in 1965, Bruce went to Hong Kong twice in 1965. First time when his father passed, and then the second time he brought Linda and Brandon and all of them there. And that's when supposedly Bruce Lee asked Grandmaster Yip Man to teach him the wooden dummy, and for whatever reason, Grandmaster Yip Man.
Let me also touch on that, because I remember reading in Long Ting's book
Yep.
that Bruce wanted to learn the wooden dummy set, and that he offered to buy a flat, an apartment
Right.
for Ip Man. Bruce didn't have the money to buy an apartment for anybody, let alone Ip Man.
Yes.
That's nonsense.
I remember reading that story. What you have to understand is that story is in the 116 Wooden Dummy Techniques book. And that information was provided by Yip Chun, because that is in the section in the back that Yip Chun had written. That was not from Leung Ting's own whatever, right? I do know that shortly before he went to Hong Kong on that trip, he had gotten the advance, which was $1,800 for the Charlie Chan's number one son. So he had a little bit of extra money. Definitely
not enough to buy an apartment building.
Not to buy a flat. I think what they might have meant, what I probably have to do at some point, I have to get a Chinese version of that book and see if it exists and see what the Chinese text says, because that is Chinglish translated from Chinese. So it's quite possible they meant like it was the equivalent of 1 month's rent for a flat, as opposed to it being a whole flat itself, right? And
on that point too, though, Wang Song Leong said in an interview, they're asking, how much, because that's always been the Wing Chun guys stuff. Bruce didn't really know the full system, so he wasn't that good at it.
Always their attack on him, yeah.
Oh, yeah. And Wong said, well, Bruce knew the first, I think he said the first 3 forms. So that would be Buji as well, right?
Yeah, up to Sinum Tao Cham Kyu Buji, yeah.
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 And they asked him about the dummy, how much he learned about that. And he said, well, he only learned the first, I'll get this wrong, but it was like the first 30 movements or something on the dummy.
First 3 sets, basically.
And they said, well, how come you didn't teach him rest? He said, because there wasn't any. He said Ip Man used to make it up because he didn't know he was going to teach. He'd learned it, or whatever part of it, and then he would improvise. So he said, so it changed every time Ip Man demonstrated it. So he said there was no dummy set that was, 106 movements, say, or whatever it is.
Right.
And so, as far as Bruce not learning the whole system, discount the wooden dummy set, and you've basically got the knives.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, I'm both a kind of hardcore Wing Chun nerd and like a huge Bruce Lee fan. And, when I hear some people go, oh, well, he didn't know the whole system. Well, I mean, like, without him knowing the whole system, he trained much more, had much better understanding and much better experience than many of these guys walking around with grandmaster titles claiming that they know the whole system.
Right.
And so
a lot of those, aren't there?
Tons of those. It's ridiculous. And so I never prescribed to that kind of, because especially Wing Chun is a style that even if you don't learn the entire system, the formal system, the promise of Wing Chun is that you can learn how to fight in a relatively short period of time. So you don't even need to know all of Wing Chun to be able to defend yourself. And then their attack is as if Bruce Lee was somehow claiming to be the authority on Wing Chun, which he never did. He never claimed that, but they always attack him somehow as if he did.
He had too much respect for Ip Man.
Absolutely. And before we get into perhaps the fight of all Bruce Lee fights, I kind of wanted to go back because we mentioned a little bit about MMA during that time. The big fight sport besides boxing, which Bruce had also done, was point fighting in karate. And so the champions at that time, they were all, I did point fighting karate when I was a kid, and it was like, there's barely any contact and you get a point for if this hypothetically would have landed, it would have hypothetically felled my opponent. And so when you look at people like Chuck Norris, who, Chuck Norris, he's great, Invasion USA, great canon movie, right? But, Lone Wolf McQuaid, where if the only reason I'm sometimes easy on Chuck Norris, even though he says crazy stuff, is because he did one time say, and I'm not a huge David Carradine fan, that David Carradine is as good of a martial artist as I am an actor. And I thought, okay, so he gets a little bit of a pass on some of the other nonsense that he says occasionally. But there has been from time to time interviews, excerpts where Chuck Norris, among others, say, well, Bruce wasn't competing at that time. And then you go, well,
backhanded compliments.
Yeah, backhanded in what? In a pretend tag game of why did they even bother having weight class? If you say someone is a heavyweight karate champion in point fighting, I mean, they didn't even need to have weight classes, right? It just meant that they're heavyweight, so the other guy is equally as slow, so they have to group them by that. But now they have these opinions, like what they have to say about Bruce Lee, and it's like they were coming to him to learn. So what's your take on that?
My take is the same as yours. I don't think they're qualified to comment on it. Yes, they knew him. In some cases, he taught them, which is interesting. But that's where it ends. You know, they're not fit to judge him.
Right.
I remember talking to Mito Uehara, who was a publisher of Black Belt.
O'Hara Publications as well, yeah.
Yeah. And he knew them all, right? He featured everybody and anybody who was anybody in martial arts in Black Belt magazine. And he was categorical. None of them were in Bruce Lee's level. Now, you know, he could, I don't know why he would lie to me about that. But nevertheless, he also said that Bruce had an ability to analyze. Like if you went to a tournament and he watched Louis Delgado and Chuck Norris fighting, he'd say, oh, there's a weakness, there's a weakness. And what he would do with guys like Joe Louis is say, okay, when you fight this guy, he does this. And when he does that, you do this. And he'd give them basically the pass key to unlock their defense. And they'd do it and they'd win. And since it was point karate, no one really got hurt. And the technique scored just as Bruce predicted. And to kind of establish what this means, I spoke to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and I had interviewed Joe Louis, the one and only time I ever spoke to Joe Louis. And ostensibly I was asking Joe about Bruce's training. You know, how did he work out? How did he build his body? And Joe immediately went on about, oh, Bruce was a skinny little guy, you know, and we don't know if he could take a punch. He had a skinny neck and blah, 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 which kind of put me back. It was like, and then he was telling me why he should be in the magazine instead of an article on Bruce. So anyway, that was, yes. So when I spoke to Kareem, I just said, hey, geez, I just got off the phone with Joe Louis. And he was telling me, you know, he didn't know if Bruce could take a punch or whatever. And Kareem laughed. He said, Joe Louis said that? And I said, yeah. And he goes, man, he goes, I remember being at Bruce's house and Bruce wanted me to spar with him, Joe Louis. And he said, Bruce told me what to do. And he said, Joe couldn't touch me. And similarly, Herb Jackson told me a similar story. He said that Joe went down to Chinatown with Bruce. They went to school. It was at night. And he wanted Herb to glove up with Joe. So he did. And Herb was like a welder. He was a steel worker. He wasn't a guy who lived and breathed fighting all the time, but he was a guy that was quite keen and interested in Bruce's art. And Joe Louis is a good fighter. I mean, there's no getting around it. The guy knew how to fight and how to hurt people. And during this little session, Joe did an open hand strike on Herb's ears. And Herb said he thought he popped his eardrum, and it hurt him. And he took a knee. And Herb said Bruce got pissed and said, give me the gloves. And he said, this is Herb's words. He said, Joe Louis says he never sparred Bruce Lee. He goes, he's a liar. He said, I saw him spar him. And he said, and so did Ted. And he said, Bruce put the gloves on. And basically, he said, Joe couldn't touch him. He was in, he was out. He was popping him, he was out. And he said afterwards, I just wanted to let him know that he didn't have all the answers. But he was pissed that he hurt one of his students who was a friend of his. So Bruce stood in. So for these same people to therefore say, well, you know, he was in the movies, so he wasn't really proving himself in the ring, it didn't mean anything. Right. You know? And if Bruce was all bullshit, they had their opportunity to do something about it, to bell this cat. No one did. That's simply historical fact. Ted Wong told me that of the celebrity martial arts students that Bruce had, that Mike Stone was the best. He said Bruce told him, you know, this guy could, typical Bruce, this guy could be another Bruce Lee, he said. That's how good Stone was. I think they were sparring once and Mike did a kick and it took Bruce's glasses off. Bruce was like, whoa, you know, this guy's good. So he liked Mike Stone's ability above the others.
Right.
And yeah, as far as a point karate guy judging Bruce Lee, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, I remember Bill Wallace telling me once, and I like Bill Wallace a lot, because he was a guy that did the point karate, had a wrestling background, and then he went full contact karate and was undefeated. I think he was 23-0 with like 13 KOs. Like he was
could basically only kick with one leg.
One leg, yeah,
right.
60 miles an hour or something. His leg was clocked at, but Where was I going with this?
You talk
Bill
about
Wallace.
what Bill Wallace had to say about Bruce Lee, and that you respect him, but I think something was coming.
Oh, he was telling me about. I was saying, yeah, I did. I was talking about Bruce Lee, and he said, "Oh, Bill Wallace. I would have loved to have fight him. I would have loved to have fought him." And I said, you see guys like Chuck Norris on TV saying, "Well, I was a world champion and Bruce was in movies." He goes, "Nah." He goes, "You got to remember." He goes, "Back in those days," he said, "you could win a world championship by going to Chicago and fighting 3 guys from Chicago." He said, so world championships weren't really world championships.
Sure.
So he was very candid about that.
Right.
And I respected him for that. A lot of martial artists try to make themselves better by putting Bruce down. Chuck did that at the beginning of his career.
Yeah.
And maybe he was tired of being asked about him.
Yeah.
I get that.
But he had to walk that back. There's that letter from Chuck Norris to Bruce Lee where he's very apologetic about like, "Oh, I didn't mean to make it seem like, you're the best kung fu man," or whatever. Like, and even during Bruce Lee's lifetime, it seemed Chuck already had to walk back some of his comments.
Well, there was my memory is not what it was, but I recall one of Bruce's students telling me that he had heard that Chuck had told people that that Bruce wasn't teaching him. They were sharing ideas. It was mutual.
Right. An exchange.
Yeah. And Bruce phoned him at his school. Chuck was teaching a class and said, "I want you to hold your phone out so I can hear, and you tell your students that I am your teacher, or at least I am teaching you. This is not an exchange of ideas." And apparently he did.
Wow.
Now, this is hearsay.
Sure.
But I have no reason to suspect that that's not true.
Right.
And the other thing that is sort of my BS detector on claims about Bruce's ability or lack thereof is that when you interview enough people that knew Bruce, you recognize that he was like the Missouri of martial arts. It was show me what you got, right? And so if you had won a tournament and again, remember these guys had their own styles, and they were, for what it's worth, they were world champions. They were in the magazines. Their egos were such that when they won a world championship, they clearly believed they were world champions. They were the best in the business. How do you go from that to driving to some actor's place for a martial arts lesson?
Right.
What has to happen for that to happen? I don't buy for a minute that Bruce was chatting with Chuck in an elevator and his knowledge of the history of martial arts was so fascinating that Chuck had to sign up for lessons.
Right.
I think what happened was Bruce said, "Hey, yeah, you look good, but you got holes," or whatever.
Right.
And it was step out of the elevator and show me what you got.
Sure.
Just like he did with any martial artist that is honest and will tell you about it. He probably tied them up.
Yeah.
And showed them what he would do in a certain situation, and that was enough. Why would Chuck Norris, as a world champion and a guy with all this knowledge himself, on equal par with Bruce Lee, need to learn Chi Sao?
Exactly. I was just about to say that. I remember in one of the daytimers that Bruce Lee had, I once saw a photo of it. It might have even been in one of your books, and it specifically said, like, I don't know, 3 p.m., whatever the time was.
Yeah.
Chuck Norris, Chi Sao. Like,
yeah.
Chuck Norris is not teaching Bruce Chi Sao for sure, right?
No. And how would that benefit him in point karate, where you're back like this, you strike, and then you go back? Right. There's no interaction and trapping or anything like that. So why is he teaching that?
Yeah, he needs to learn stuff. He's missing stuff.
Clearly, yeah. Bruce was doing that. And, there was, I can talk about this for hours because it's a pet peeve. Chuck Norris in his quasi-autobiography said that he was sparring Bruce in his backyard and Bruce couldn't block his kicks. Couldn't block him. Chuck was, just blazing speed. Now, you can define Chuck Norris any way you want, but blindingly fast ain't one of the terms that's coming to mind.
No, words that come to mind for me, bearded.
But anyway, he said after this impromptu sparring session, Bruce sat down, was back against a tree, and they're eating oranges, and Bruce was frustrated. He said, "Chuck, no matter how I tried, I couldn't block your kicks. What am I doing wrong?" To which Chuck replied, Bruce, sometimes you have to move slower to be faster.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's some wisdom right there.
And that's something, putting that on a family crest, but
Or a fortune cookie.
yeah, it was like, I don't believe that happened. It was Chuck's attempt to do Zen and the Martial Arts by Joe Hyams. But again, the no disrespect to anybody who does martial arts. It doesn't matter what the discipline is. If you're going to commit your life to something and achieve mastery of it, thumbs up. I fully support and respect that. What I don't respect is trying to pull other people down, particularly after they're dead, in order to advance yourself.
Right.
That's wrong.
Absolutely.
And it's unnecessary.
Yeah.
I mean, if you were in any other discipline, let's say we're talking, instead of martial arts, we're talking painting, and you studied with Picasso. He looked at your artwork and he thought, you know what, Alex, why don't you try this or try that, see how that works. And you do it and improves your painting. And then Picasso dies. And someone comes up to you and says, hey, you studied under Picasso. What was it like? And you go, he wasn't really that good. I've been in 6 galleries. He was, he was an amateur. He was okay. He looked good when he did a TV interview, but he wasn't. Or would you say, you know what? He was a generational talent, and I was really lucky to have spent the time with him that I did.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And then you move on.
Yeah.
Topic's over. But when you start putting down other people, and it's like you have to take us for fools. We can see the film.
Yeah.
We know who's faster. We know who's more athletic.
Right.
And I'm sorry, dude, it sounds like we're bashing Chuck Norris. I don't mean to do it, but, I mean, you watch his fight sequences in any of his movies, Force of One, The Octagon, whatever. He's never looked as good as he did in The Way of the Dragon when Bruce choreographed.
Takes 2 to tango.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just, he was the most stiff wooden performer I've ever seen.
Right.
So, why are we still talking about Bruce Lee? Why are there statues erected to Bruce Lee's memory in Bosnia?
Yeah.
In China, in Los Angeles, in Hong Kong? And no statues of Chuck Norris that seem to be going up, anywhere.
Right.
There's a difference. People can see a certain difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And Bruce certainly didn't have any fear of any of these guys at all.
Right.
Like,
right.
I remember the audio recording that he had dictated about his art, where he talked about these guys. But it was, he was, to back up, to present his exhibits, he was quoting what these guys had said in Black Belt magazine about him.
So there's an audio recording of this. Is this something available like on YouTube or?
I don't think so. Only a portion of it appeared in my film Warrior's Journey.
Okay. Yeah.
But where it has the Star Week thing and Bruce's 3 pupils, and Bruce is reading what that article said about it.
God. Oh yeah. I think I remember now. It's been a while since I said I got to revisit that documentary.
But he went through different martial artists, from Louis Delgado and Alex Steen, and right through to these other people. But I mean, he was a generational talent, and any guy that can devote the time that he did to his art and to live it. I mean, not just, I'm going to do 2 hours and then, I'm going to do something else. He was either talking about martial arts or he was practicing martial arts, and that was it.
Right.
And just like me, when I was a kid, if you didn't want to talk about Bruce Lee, we had nothing to talk about. If you didn't want to talk martial arts, he had nothing to talk to you about.
Right. Right.
That was his passion, and looking for, if you look at his notes in the book Commentaries on the Martial Way, which were based on his surviving writings, most of his notes on the other arts are looking for weaknesses. What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses?
Right.
How do I defeat that? And who thinks like that? I mean, this is a guy who's thinking fighting 24/7.
Yeah.
I don't think that way.
Right.
Last thing in my world, if I see a guy walking down the street, is, how can I kick the shit out of that guy? It's not. But that was Bruce, right? And like, he'd walk in a crowd. I remember someone telling me, and he would look for broken rhythm patterns, look for predictable movement. And when you do that, if that's the way your brain is geared, and you see multiple people walking and you're trying to look for these patterns in all these different people, I mean, that's some kind of cerebral activity that's going on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Being in a restaurant, you're having dinner with Bruce and he's talking, and every 3 seconds he goes, and you go, like, what? Like, what's going on? He said, oh, I'm just watching the guy eating behind you, and every time I'm trying to get the rhythm when he's bringing the fork up and try and hit in between the beat. I mean, who does this kind of stuff?
Right.
You
A
know?
special kind of genius or maniac or both.
Yeah, well, a fine line. But
Right.
I remember it was just, I mean, that's what he did. Bolo's told the story about the audio stuff he was listening to, drops of water versus traffic noises, and bringing up the sound of the traffic, but still trying to be able to just focus on the water. And I mean, everything was geared to combat and
Right.
how to react quicker, how to relax so that you can respond quicker.
Right.
And it's just, I don't know anybody today that does that.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. Very, very few people dedicate that much to anything nowadays. Now, speaking of another topic that doesn't want to die, the Wong Jack Man fight, which, of course, a few years ago was given the Dragon, the Bruce Lee story treatment via the Birth of the Dragon movie. And, you know, I mean, for me,
Shaolin monk, no less.
yeah, Shaolin. He was a Shaolin monk, and Bruce was just some punk who was somehow making movies in 1964. Maybe not yet making movies.
Yeah.
I mean, timeline-wise, the whole thing was a bit of a mess. Now, it seems the only controversy about the Wong Jack Man fight is that Wong Jack Man lied about it later. If it were not for that, Bruce was pretty open about, yeah, he won, but he wasn't 100% satisfied with the way it had gone. And it seems that that's kind of open and shut. But like, when people tell me the fight was controversial, I'm like, who told you that? Wong Jack Man? I mean, where was the controversy, right? Now, you obviously you knew and know Linda Lee, his widow, who was also there. Did she ever tell you her account of the fight, or did you ever talk to anyone who was there and just give you like kind of a basic account of what had gone on?
Well, Linda was the only one who was there that I spoke to. James Lee had died in 72, so long before I came on the scene. And he was the only other person from that camp that was a witness to it. Linda told me that it was exactly as she described it in her book, that these people came, Wong Jack Man and his entourage, and they presented a challenge to Bruce. Bruce accepted. Once he accepted, they suddenly realized perhaps they'd made a mistake and wanted to set ground rules, no hitting in the face, no kicking in the groin, and Bruce, being Bruce, waved that aside.
Those are his two favorite things. What are they talking about? I can't take that away.
Yeah. And then, the fight began, and I think Bruce attempted to do the same thing he did in Seattle, which was the chain punching. But Wong Jack Man was a self-preservationist, and he turned and ran. And there was like a change room which had two doors, and they were going through that. And eventually, he lost his footing on something, and Bruce pounded him when he was down and asked him if he gave up, and he did. And that was the end of it.
Right.
And then later, when Linda wrote her book, I think he launched a lawsuit against her.
Right.
But that was thrown out by the judge.
Sure.
Then later, one of his students published an article in one of the lower end karate magazines. It wasn't Black Belt. It was like
Karate Illustrated or something.
Yeah, I used to have it, actually. I think it had a red cover, actually, the one that I remember. And in this one, suddenly we're told that it was a 20-minute bout, which is substantial. And that
how does that even work? I don't know.
Yeah, and Wong could have killed him if he wanted to. He had him in a headlock, and you know how deadly a headlock and a unicorn fist can be.
That's right, or a wet willy or a noogie or something.
Yeah. But, and then, Bruce was disrespectful. He went for his eyes right away when this guy was very graciously offering to shake his hand, which, of course, being a Chinese martial arts practitioner, the handshake is part of the culture.
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah, and there was no controversy. The fight was over almost as soon as it started, and unlike the movie, and unlike the counter view, Bruce didn't change his art as a result of fighting Wong Jack Man.
Right.
Go to Wong Jack Man and say, please take me as a student to learn. What he changed was his physical conditioning approach. He started training more like a boxer. He was doing road work then, and riding a bicycle, skipping a rope, and trying to up his endurance so that should he get into an encounter that was going to be protracted, he would have, the shelf life or the battery power to stay with it for the full length. Because he did tell Linda that he said, I'm glad the guy gave up when he did. He said, because I was out of gas. You know, if he'd gotten up, you know, then I might have been in a bit of trouble, but
Right.
he didn't. So,
Yeah, I recently just read that again in Doug Palmer's new book on Bruce Lee, where he recounted that, saying, like, you know, when Bruce had him, he was lucky that he gave up because he felt he didn't have anything left in the gas tank at that point, right?
And I think that's what happened. And, you know, and again, no disrespect to Wong Jack Man, but, you know, you were fighting a better guy.
Right.
And as simple as that. And I remember, it's funny, you know, I remember when Bruce Lee's movie Return of the Dragon came out in Canada. It was reviewed by a critic for the Toronto Star newspaper named Clyde Gilmore. And he said, you know, Bruce Lee, wiry little muscle man, beats Chuck Norris. And everybody knows that, you know, in a real fight, a good big man always beats a good little man. I thought that may be true, but a good big man doesn't beat a great little man. And
Right.
And the same is true with Wong Jack Man's case. I mean, good martial artist, perhaps. I mean, it's one of these things. I almost hate talking martial arts because you always have to temper what you say because of the students of these people.
Yes, of course.
And there's this.
I'm not worried about Wong Jack Man's students, though, just so you know, all right? I'm in New York. I'm on the 4th floor. They'll be tired by the time they get up here.
But they're, you know, I haven't met a student of a martial artist that doesn't think his teacher is the deadliest guy on the planet.
100%.
Doesn't happen. My teacher, you know, he can do this, he can do that. When I was growing up and taking karate, there was a guy, and of course I was green as grass. I didn't know anything about Bruce Lee other than what I read in the magazines. And it was obvious I was a huge fan. So this guy who was like, I was like a yellow belt and he was like a green belt. And he was saying, Bruce Lee was shit. I was like, what? He said, oh yeah. He goes, he said, it's like when they went to Taiwan. He said, and if they go to Thailand and they use all their poison finger bullshit, he goes, the Thai boxers just knock them out all the time, and blah, blah, blah. And I was crushed, you know, because it was like, here was a guy that knew more about martial arts than I did.
Right.
Telling me that, and I had no frame of reference to gauge it by. So it was cool when I got to the estate and I got to see things like his daytime diaries, because then suddenly it put the lie to a lot of claims that I grew up hearing. Who spent time with him? Who Bruce Lee studied under? If you believe all these people, he had more degrees than a thermometer. You know, he studied with everybody and anybody, and that's simply not true.
Right.
You know, there was a guy in Toronto who taught kung fu, and he's claimed, maybe to this day, Bruce Lee came to him for instruction.
Sure.
That's like, I don't think so, pal. You know, but and once I saw the daytime diaries, this guy's name wasn't even in it. You know, I don't know nothing for address or contacts or anything. And yet Bruce somehow went to this guy in Toronto, you know, from California, to study kung fu. I don't think so.
Wow. So, wow, we're already through an hour here. Before we get out of here, I had so much written down I wanted to talk to you about, but like, as is very typical with the topic of Bruce Lee, every single topic about Bruce Lee is a wormhole in and of itself, where you could just go and go really deep. Since we are talking about Bruce Lee's fights, there is my pet project, which is also kind of what brought us together in recent weeks, is discussing this supposed fight between Bruce Lee and Lau Tai Chuen. Now, you know, it's kind of one of those things, like, did it? Some people said happened. Some people say it didn't happen. Obviously, you had a little bit of access to some of the notes. This is a Hong Kong thing, which it always tends to be a little bit more obscure than like the stuff he did day in and day out in LA. But before we started to discuss this, had you heard much about the Lau Tai Chuen fight, or was this something that was ever on your radar?
Well, it was on my radar when I first learned of it. It was like, wow, he had a fight. You know, I think I read it, and probably the same place you did. There was a Hong Kong publication that came out in the 70s, and it talked about Bruce fighting on the lawn of a police detective's house. He'd been challenged by this fellow in the newspaper. And of course, you know, I devoured everything that came out of Hong Kong in those days. You know, Bruce on the set of The Big Boss beat up a champion kickboxer. Yay, you know,
Right.
But so I, you know, as I got older, I thought, well, you know, maybe it was just one of those apocryphal pieces that doesn't really mean much. But then I interviewed Bolo, and I have no idea why I asked him this, but I said, we might have been talking about the fight Bruce had with the extra on the set.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, oh, the only other Hong Kong fight I heard, you know, was with Lau Tai Chuen, you know, and we don't know if that's true. And he goes, oh, it's true. He said, I asked him on the set of Enter the Dragon if it happened. And he said, yeah, but don't tell anybody. And I asked Bolo what he'd heard, and he had heard that Lau Tai Chuen was a boxer. I don't know if he was like a Western boxer.
I think he was a Western boxer. At least that's what I understood from the newspaper articles about it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's what Bolo said. He said that he threw some punches at Bruce, which Bruce adroitly slipped, and then hit him with one kick, and the thing was over in like 30 seconds.
Right.
And Bruce said to Bolo, don't tell anyone. Now, it's interesting that Bruce says that after every real fight he's had. After the fight in Seattle, he immediately tells the students, don't say anything about it. But of course, they're Westerners, so they're going to tell anyone that, is willing to listen. In Hong Kong, when he says that to his stuntmen and people that are close to him, they keep their mouth shut. They respect that bond, right? They're not going to say anything. But after every fight, including Wong Jack Man, Bruce's attitude was keep it on the down low. Now, part of the keeping it on the down low for the Seattle and the Wong Jack Man fight was probably because he didn't want that getting back to Ip Man in Hong Kong, that Bruce is using Wing Chun or something over here in the States. But it's also part of his persona that he didn't want word to get out about this.
Right.
It only causes more trouble, right? Suddenly then you're a badass and people come looking for you too.
Sure.
So after the Lau Tai Chuen fight, apparently he not only paid for whatever the hospital bill was to reset his jaw or whatever he did to him, but it was also, we're not talking about it.
Right.
And it's funny, speaking with Bolo and reading the Hong Kong publication, I had this vision of Lau Tai Chuen as being kind of like a Roberto Duran figure, like really badass, the beard and vicious. And I saw the video of him being interviewed and was like, are you kidding me?
He's kind of a doughy Chinese guy. He looks like one of the waiters from Way of the Dragon.
Skinny. You tell me it lasted 30 seconds? I don't think so. Not with this guy, it didn't. So
right.
It was, it was one of these ones that was built up on my mind until I saw the guy. And I thought, well, yeah, of course, Bruce would take him apart, and it would have been very quick. So, no, it's a fascinating fight. And you actually rekindled my interest in it because you were going on about it and your research. And I think it's fascinating because it's his last BAMO.
Yeah. Yeah.
Essentially.
Yeah. I still, I'm as soon as I can travel back to Hong Kong again, this is on the list of things that I'm, still looking to research. And I really hope that I can find some kind of definitive answer on it. It's just difficult because unfortunately, a lot of the people who would know have passed away. And, as you know, sometimes from doing this kind of research, you sometimes feel that you might as well just title it Fuzzy Memories. and
that's
very, very difficult to verify these things. Well, hey, yes.
I just want to make one last point, and that is with regard to Bruce's ability and juxtaposing that or in reference to MMA, grappling, et cetera, et cetera. One of the coolest guys that I spoke to that knew and worked out with Bruce Lee was Hayward Nishioka. Hayward was a Pan Am gold medalist in judo. He's a karate black belt. Very good judo man. Like, you talk about grappling, he's not a guy you want to get a hold of you. And he told me categorically, Bruce was on another level. He said he would be 15 feet away, come in, hit you, and he'd be back out again. You couldn't grab him. And I saw that actually someone had interviewed him recently on YouTube, and he repeated the anecdote that he told me, which was, he said, I was sparring or trying to spar with Bruce. And he said, remember, I'm not an amateur. He said, I'm a gold medalist, Pan Am Games judo. I'm a black belt, Shotokan, I think, karate. Lots of tournaments, won tournaments. He said, I was getting so frustrated because I couldn't do anything with it. He said, I got so frustrated. I said, well, that's fine, Bruce. He said, you're faster than me. And he said, but, my game is judo. I'm a ground guy. He said, what would you do if I lay down on the ground and, beckoned you in? And Bruce looked at him and said, well, I wouldn't do anything. I'd walk away. And Hayward looked at him, and then Bruce said, but don't get up. So, the thing is that they say, 9 90% of the fights end up on the ground. Maybe, but 100% start standing up.
Absolutely.
And Bruce was, like I say, he was almost of a different species in that. His speed, his willingness to hurt you, which is something that you can't teach.
Right.
You either go to that black zone or you can't go to that black zone. And
Sure.
he could go instant. And he'd have no qualms about going for your eyes. He'd have no qualms about breaking your shin. And he had the speed and the delivery system to get in and out before you could execute. I spoke to Joey Orbio, who was a boxer. I think he fought Jerry Query, like good boxer. And he told me of a time where Bruce, they met at outside a stadium. They've been to a martial arts tournament or something, and Bruce was impressed with boxing. And he said, "Oh, you're a boxer. Hey, that's really cool." And Joey said, yeah. Anyway, they end up sparring because that's Bruce. So for these guys who say, "Oh, I met Bruce Lee and he was only in movies, he never really sparred," that wasn't his MO.
Right.
If he met you and you were doing something, show me what you got.
Right.
And Joey said the same thing. He said, "I've been in with Jerry Query. I couldn't touch him." He said he was in and out, boom, I couldn't do anything. So Bruce Lee was not a normal person. He was not a normal martial artist. His nervous system, his muscular system, his neuromuscular system was wired in a way that ours typically aren't. And in the same way that Michael Jordan was a phenom at basketball and Tiger Woods was, showing his golf prowess at age 6 on the Tonight Show, that was what Bruce Lee was like. And, for those who claim he couldn't fight, for those who say he was just a movie actor, do a little more research,
right?
Because clearly are misinformed about this guy. Anything you saw in the movies, within reason, in terms of fighting, he was even more lethal in real life from everyone I spoke to. And I was one of those guys that had heard all the naysayers before I had a means to fact check things.
Right.
And once I did, what surprised me and delighted me was that this fellow whom I had idolized for so long was everything I thought he was. There were no chips in the plaster. If anything, he was more lethal than I had envisioned he was.
Wow.
Because at that point, I thought, my karate instructor was, he's pretty close. He's pretty close.
He's right up there, maybe a notch below.
Not now. Not now. I recognize this guy couldn't carry Bruce's gym bag.
Wow.
That's just the way it was.
That's really incredible. Hey, I had so much fun with this. I really hope we can do this again. I looked at all my notes here, all the things I wanted to talk to you about, and I got to about 20% of them.
Well, it was great talking to you, Alex. And again, I love your show, and I love the way you've done your intro with the old Shaw Brothers type thing. That's so cool.
Thank you. Glad you appreciate that. This was really great. Thanks a lot. We'll see you soon, and we'll stay in touch.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Little.
Thank you.
So which one of Bruce Lee's fights did you find the most interesting? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you guys next time.
Word is I'm a kung fu genius. Technique speaks for me, not lineage. Forget Jet Li, cause I'm the one. Many call me seafood, but to you I'm sea kung. And I produce masters. You surpassed us. Your kung fu stiffer than corpse and caskets. City Wing Chun is the house I built. Violate the gate and your blood gets spilt. Alex Richter, always the...
One of the foremost experts on Bruce Lee. This is going to be the tongue twister right here.
It's not a tongue twister. It's just words that communicate a really basic ass idea. Words communicating basic ass
that
idea.
I barely use. All right.
Yeah, the word
Considered
foremost.
by many. Yeah. All right, peeps. On today's episode of the Kung Fu Genius, the Genius will chat with John Little, considered to be one of the most foremost.
One of the most foremost?
One of the most considered
By many. One nickname you'll never have is One Take Jake. All right, let's go. Let's do this.
All right, peeps. On today's episode, it came in too weird.
Dude,
Considered by many.
Yes, you almost had it.
Yeah. Almost.
All right, which means this will take forever today. It's always where one of your early takes is very close that you end up taking the longest.
Oh, no. There's a formula.
Yeah, there's a formula. When you mess up like really bad, then eventually you just get it on one, right? But when you get close the first couple times,
No,
it's they're usually the worst.
Fuck me. All right, peeps. On today's episode of the Kung Fu Genius, the genius will be chatting with John Little, one of the
Wait. I'm not sure if I'm going to have to bleep any of that out. I'm going to have to listen to that again. It sounded profane, but I'm not sure if there were actual, like, any intelligible words in there.
Why is it so crazy? What's so crazy? Why is it? I had it.
I'm sorry.
All right, peeps. On today's episode of the Kung Fu Genius, the genius will be chatting with John Little, considered by many to be one of the foremost experts on Bruce Lee. All right, peeps. On today's episode, goodness, man, why is this happening?
It's my fault.
Considered to be the bomb, la bomba, dumba dumba do, la bomba. He is the bomba.
6.5 minutes.
No, why?
It was so good. We're never leaving today. You know what I think we should do? We should just film a bunch of canned responses that I have, and I can leave.
Yeah, we could do that.
Right? But we're going to need like an hour of them.
Canned responses.
And then you could just have me here like freaking out, and then I can peace out, and he can take as long as he wants.
We're never gonna leave.
We're never leaving.